this is a great way to overcome imposter syndrome. This idea
Right.
that, I may not be good right now at this one thing, but look what I can do that's analogous.
Hey, welcome back. As you can see, we've got an exciting change of routine on the agenda for today. I recently had the chance to sit down with Jay Heinrichs to talk about his new book, Aristotle's Guide to Self-Persuasion: How Ancient Rhetoric, Taylor Swift, and Your Own Soul Can Help You Change Your Life. And we had a great time talking about rhetoric, the writing life, and even a couple of questions that came from those of you on Discord. And
Wait. You mean we're getting someone else in this one? Like, I'm getting a break from you?
that's right, bud.
Huh. Maybe dreams can come true. Maybe I'll watch this one.
You're way too kind. But seriously, Jay shared a lot of great stuff with me, so I don't want to keep you in suspense any longer. Let's zoom on over to the interview and get right into the good stuff.
Well, Jay, it's such a pleasure to have you here today with us on the show. I guess as a place to start, I always, and to define terms, which is usually a useful thing to do. If it's okay if I ask you a two-part question at the beginning, I always think it's interesting to hear how people come to discover rhetoric. You describe it, and other people have described it as kind of a lost art. And so I'd love to know, how do you find your way to this lost art? And then, so that we know what we're talking about today, what is, in your conception, what is rhetoric? How would you define it?
Well, let me start with a definition then.
For sure.
As we always should. Any writer should start that way. Rhetoric is the art and practice of the power of words. And it allows people to disagree without violence and make choices together, even when they have completely different perspectives. Now, how did I get into it? I was not a good student when I was a kid. I hung out in the library and pulled books at random from the shelves and read them. All along, I thought words have got to do more than sit around looking pretty. I noticed, as most people do, that words really affect people. Soldiers sacrifice their lives to the power of words. People do things they regret the next morning because of the power of words. And I wanted to know what that power was. The problem was that my education, such as it was, didn't give me any of that, didn't teach me what that power was. And so even in college, I went to a good college because I got into the one my mother had gone to, and they didn't teach rhetoric there. I went to graduate school for a joint PhD in English and political science, thinking that will teach me the power of words. Quickly realized academia and I wouldn't get along very well, so I dropped out. It wasn't until years later I found myself in a job as an administrator at Dartmouth College here in New Hampshire, where I live still. And I was bored in my job. So I resumed my old habit of pulling books at random down from the stacks. I found myself in this corner of the Dartmouth College library where half the fluorescent bulbs had been burned out. There were cobwebs literally on the books. And I thought, this is interesting. And like, what is this that no one has checked out clearly in many years? And a book bound in red caught my eye, and I pulled it down, and it had John Quincy Adams' signature in it. It turns out Adams was a 38-year-old senator when he gave a series of lectures at Harvard as its first Boylston professor of rhetoric and oratory. And I'm standing there in the stacks holding the book up to one light I could find. And in his first lecture, Adams said to these teenage students and to me to catch from the relics of ancient oratory those unresisted powers which mold the mind of man to the will of the speaker and yield the guidance of the nation to the dominion of the voice. And I thought, that's it. That's it. So I read all the other lectures, which turned out to be a kind of syllabus of the ancient Greeks and Romans I should be reading. I spent the next 20 years driving my family crazy, bothering rhetoricians, linguists, neuroscientists around the world until I finally wrote my first book about rhetoric, about the power of words.
Wow. I feel like if there's a place to find it, it's in with the cobwebs and the failing lights. That's a poetic way to get there.
Yeah, just think if those books had been cleaned, I would never have written about rhetoric.
It does. It seems so often that it comes to people by accident, which is interesting given, the long history that it has, um,
Yeah,
even until recently.
that's true until recently. So rhetoric has undergone a kind of revival. The AP English language course has a deep rhetorical component. So students in high schools, the brightest ones, are learning rhetoric. Rhetoric is being taught increasingly in business schools, law schools. So I'm seeing it come back for a really good reason because it gives people a purpose for learning the humanities. It's the
Yeah.
humanities that can actually get you a job.
Hey, that sounds good.
Doesn't it though?
No, it does. And yeah, I mean, I think that people are increasingly recognizing that, like midway through the 20th century to now, this revival is real and it's really valuable. And I think, for so much of its history, it's been really, I think, like you said, a way to disagree without violence. Aristotle talks about it as being a way to address a mass audience and persuade them, right? Um,
Yes, and address them in a way that leads them to a better future. And so
yeah,
his favorite kind of rhetoric focused on the future tense. He called it deliberative rhetoric, which is about choices. So the past tense is all about the harm somebody did and how they should be punished. The present tense is about values, what's good, who's bad, who's in and out of the tribe. The future tense is about deliberation, about choices. And that was Aristotle's favorite kind of rhetoric. And so, yeah, that is how you persuade an audience to make a choice that people can agree on.
but if we can get to your book, you take a slightly different approach to rhetoric than I'm used to, right? Like we often think about it as speaker audience. I think Plato in his Phaedrus takes a little bit more of an intimate approach where it's maybe more of a one-on-one thing. But from the title, you had my attention, Aristotle's Guide to Self-Persuasion. This is not, I think, the conventional way to think of rhetoric. Um, but, and I'll say from the start that I agree with you, right? Why is rhetoric the tool for this job? I think when we think about maybe self-persuasion or helping people to change their life or achieve their goals, a lot of writers in our culture now turn to tools maybe like psychology or philosophy or spiritual approaches. I think rhetoric can be the tool for the job, but it's not one that people turn to. So how do we go from mass persuading people in the ancient forum to using rhetoric as a tool to persuade ourselves to do the things we want to do today?
Well, first of all, rhetoric does not necessarily contradict all the other means of persuading ourselves that
Great.
you mentioned. I mean, Stoicism, Epicureanism, even to a degree, Buddhism, all these do come originally from the sophists who were the original teachers of rhetoric back in ancient Greece. Now, you're right, though. Rhetoric requires an audience. And so many years ago, well, not that many, my wife was sick of my sounding like an old man, uh, feeling sorry for myself for no particular reason, and nostalgic for the good old days and wondering why kids were on my lawn. And so, in self defense, I think she said to me, have you thought about using these tools which you've been teaching for years, and I had been for decades, um, on yourself? And I think she just wanted to improve my mood. And of course, I immediately said, well, no, that's impossible because how can I talk to myself? How can I persuade myself when I'm my own audience? Now, rhetoric, when it works best, actually, is when people don't realize rhetoric is being used on them.
Mm.
So that was one big obstacle. But being obedient to my wife, who I know is wiser than I am, I spent a summer doing this deep dive into books of Aristotle I had ignored in the past. And I came across one of his weirdest books, one I think he really enjoyed writing. On the Soul is the title of this book.
Uh-huh.
Now, Aristotle, besides being a philosopher, was actually a scientist. And so when he was talking about the soul, he never sounds that spiritual to start with, and he definitely doesn't here. He describes a soul that's very different from the Platonic soul or the soul we learn about in church or temple. The soul, he thinks, dies with you. So he thought, maybe it's an organ in the body, or maybe it's something outside ourselves that somehow we connect to. And there's an organ in the body that helps with that. Years later, another philosopher said he had found it, the soul organ. He said it was the pituitary gland. Anyway,
Okay.
So I thought the way Aristotle was describing what the soul was, though, was that it was like your youest you, only your noblest you, your best you, the
Mm,
you really would most want to be. And I thought, that's my audience. That's how I can talk to myself as an audience, trying to convince my noble soul that I can live up to it, that I'm as good as it is. Now, one way Aristotle says to find your soul is to separate what he called your appetites, your daily wants, from your needs, which is what your soul is telling you should be doing or having. And that's a great way to determine what your noble soul is. And, frankly, that was a difficult process for me because I found
yeah.
my soul extremely annoying. I mean, it was so superior and so ashamed of me.
Oh
But
no.
it did lead to better things.
Well, you mentioned, right, like the rhetoric maybe works best when you're not aware of it. And I think this contributes to a lot of suspicion of rhetoric historically and even in the present. You don't seem to shy away from the term manipulation in the book, which is interesting. Why embrace maybe some of this language that is people tend to be suspicious of?
Well, they should be suspicious of it. And,
Okay, good.
it's an act of brutal, unrhetorical honesty on my part that I
Yeah.
call rhetoric what it is. It's a use of tools to bend the soul, as the ancient
Okay.
Romans. It's a way of changing people's mood, whether they
Hmm.
want it or not, changing their minds about things, and changing their willingness to do something or to stop doing something. Now, teaching rhetoric, even if you think it's nothing but a dark art, allows you to inoculate yourself against those very tools of manipulation. If you can spot
Right.
the manipulation, it's not going to work on you quite as well. On the other hand, at the same time, as an alternative to violence, I'll take manipulation. And it's
Yeah.
essentially you are manipulating tools the way you would with a screwdriver, and you don't feel guilty
Hmm.
about the screw. The difference is you can feel guilty about manipulating humans. It is your job, your ethical job, to make sure you use this tool well. And it's the same thing with any dangerous kind of instrument, like, I don't know, fire. It can be a blessing and a curse, and it's up to you to use it well. But in addition, rhetoric requires you to know your audience, whether
Yeah.
that audience is an entire market or your soul. And that is a kind of empathetic approach that can be done for the most selfish of reasons. So it can lead to good things as long as that goal isn't harmful. And again, that's going to be up to you.
So thinking about audience, thinking about knowing your audience, I know that mine is composed of writers who are at various stages of their writing career. And in one of the early chapters of the book, you talk about inspiration, which I'm sure for a lot of creators, but I know writers best. This is a loaded word for writers. And I think we struggle with inspiration on a couple of levels, right? We could think about inspiration where it means like motivation, like do I feel motivated? Do I feel inspired to write? And then we have inspiration of do I have good, creative, inspired ideas to write about? So as you've thought about inspiration and the role that rhetoric can play to help us to persuade ourselves to be maybe better or at least more diligent writers, what kind of advice do you have for these writers like you and me and all the rest of us who have this complex relationship with inspiration?
The thing about inspiration is my favorite inspirational story comes
Yeah.
from the gospel in the New Testament, Acts 2, where the fiery breath of God comes to a group of apostles who are sitting around, apparently drinking wine at 9 o'clock in the morning. The Bible tells me so. Some of these apostles started speaking in tongues. They started speaking languages they themselves didn't know. So all of a sudden, you had these Aramaic speakers speaking Persian and Greek and, I don't know, Chinese for all I know.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that not all of them did. And I find that
Hmm.
fascinating. As a writer, I'm thinking, okay, how would I describe that scene? And like many writers, I'm sure you do this. In your head, you're constantly writing scenes. And I find myself constantly writing scenes of me as both hero and villain or whatever. And I thought,
Uh-huh.
okay, I'm one of the apostles. I'm there drinking a tot of breakfast wine. And all of a sudden, like lightning comes from the sky. And now what? I can imagine that some of these apostles were blocking it.
Hmm.
We're saying, whoa, that's weird. Get out of here. Get out of my head. Some of the apostles were saying, huh, what am I doing? That is true inspiration to me. So Michel de Montaigne, the guy who invented the essay, he practiced what he called liberality. Of
Okay.
course, he used the Latin word, but we'll say liberality, which
Sure.
is this skeptical openness to the world. So the breath of God comes into my head. I'm a writer. I'm thinking either, this is interesting, or I'm thinking, get this out of my head. This is dangerous. This is not what I'm supposed to be doing. This could make me lose followers on
Oh no.
Instagram. And so that's one form of inspiration, is being simply open to it. Now, there's another thing that I get straight from George Saunders, who every good writer follows, I'm sure. Saunders said that great writing is rewriting. And of course, I believe that's right.
Yeah.
But more than that, if you are looking for true inspiration, one of the things to look for is, what's the problem? Now, if you're writing fiction, what is it that the character truly needs or is trying to accomplish? If it's nonfiction, the problem is, okay, what is the suspense that's leading till the end? What do I want readers to wonder what's going to happen?
Hmm.
So, in describing the problem, this is where rhetoric really helps, because rhetoricians define what the problem as the exigence, and the exigence has to do with a particular situation that needs a particular solution. And the way to find that solution, which is your inspiration, is to define that problem and keep defining it. Define it 10 different ways. So instead of doing what Saunders tells you to do right away, which is to rewrite a sentence, first write the problem. Now, this problem can be your own personal problem, or it could be something that you're reporting on and you're wondering what the story is really about. Or it can be, I've fallen in love with a character and I have no idea what this plot is going to be about. Describe that exigence as accurately as you can, and then rewrite it a dozen times, and you may find yourself coming up with an idea. That leads to the final thing. And there are a bunch of ways you can find inspiration. I have a chapter on it, and I had such a gas writing this thing. I even got into medieval taxonomy of inspiration, which you don't
That's
have
the
to
good
read
stuff.
unless you. Yeah, I mean, it shows. Frankly, Andrew, you're a total nerd just saying that, like me. In any case, the other thing is what Plato called the idea, which is the form that something takes, the absolute isness of the thing, of inspiration. And this gets back to exigence. If you keep defining things and redefining them and get to absolutely what the is, what the point is of whatever you're saying, that alone can lead to inspiration. I'm sorry, I said that was the last thing. I'll do one more.
No, please. This is wonderful.
So there are a couple, I'll do two more. There are a couple of
Even
things
better.
that writers of fiction I admire the most tell me they do. And I've written one novel that sold tens and tens of copies. So don't listen to me as a fiction writer. But I listen to fiction writers, and when they describe what they do with a character, they define the character, they fall in love with the character, and then they sort of prompt it the way you would prompt an LLM, an AI bot. And they think about what's the likeliest thing this character will do at any moment. And that's a form of inspiration, which is a kind of mechanical inspiration. Okay, what is it the likeliest thing this character will do will lead to an entire plot, especially when you mix in other characters and things get complicated. That's a hugely useful thing for someone to do in trying to come up with a character. So this idea that you're prompting. Another great source of inspiration, and I swear this is the last one, Andrew,
Okay.
is take two things and combine them. And if you look at the greatest ideas in history having to do with inventions, and look at the iPhone, I mean, Steve
Yeah.
Jobs didn't invent a thing. He combined a bunch of things to make one brilliant smartphone. And you can do that with your own ideas. And in my book, I talk about how this actually was biographical, but I didn't say so. Back when I was a journalist, I had this idea of writing about how adults can learn from the way children play when they work
Mm,
out,
yeah.
when the adults work out. Because children don't work out, they just play. And at the time, I was working in Emmaus, Pennsylvania, where the
Okay.
Rodale Publishing Company was based. And there was an elementary school playground nearby. So I took my smartwatch and I started timing what those kids were doing. And it was really interesting what they were doing if you define them in terms of workouts.
Yeah.
They would bursts of activity, 20 seconds followed by maybe 30 seconds of squatting, arguing, looking at bugs, whatever. And then they would reverse the two. And they were all doing the same sorts of things with mobility exercise, followed by active rest, followed by, the bursts of high intensity training. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if you actually came up with a kind of formula for that? And I thought I would call it, the kid again workout or the playground workout. And just as
Yeah.
I was taking notes on this, a security card came
Oh.
along. I had to leave in a hurry. I ended
Yeah.
up writing some of that, but I thought that is inspiration. I took two different things. My exigence was my desire to come up with a new way to get adults to work out so that they thought it was fun. And I combined that with this separate notion, this observation that kids do things that seem to be really good for them, which was playing. That's
Yeah.
my final inspiration.
I've had, I guess, this private definition of creativity is this ability to find these connections, right? And you don't have to create things out of whole cloth. If you can find two things that haven't been smashed together before, you can be the one to smash them together and make something great with it.
It's smash them together is even better than connections because you think two ideas that come together are a molecule. You take two elements and you have
Yeah.
something that acts completely differently.
So this is good. We've got some good advice for finding these good ideas. And I have this idea, but I also won't pick up the notebook or go to the keyboard. How do I inspire myself to actually write the thing?
How do you get yourself to write the thing? Now we're
Yeah.
talking about motivation. And Aristotle, who was the original philosopher of habits, lets us do things on autopilot. And I think that's the
Mm,
secret,
yeah.
doing the same thing over and over and over again. I mean, I pride myself on two really brilliant habits. One is flossing. Um,
Nice.
yeah, I am a champion flosser. And the other is napping, which I'm
Also
almost as good
good.
at. Yeah, and
Yeah.
the thing is that most people, and we're going to talk about writing in just a minute, but this idea of habit, I think, is really
Yeah.
here. A lot of people when you will say, "Oh, I'm so tired during the day," when I mention napping, and I'm always careful because a lot of people simply really don't have the kind of lives that allow them to do that. And
Right.
I turned 70 this month, so I can nap all I want. Old
Okay.
people can nap and probably should. But when I mention that to someone else, generally it's not that I don't have the time. Some people would say that. Most people will say, I don't nap, which is literally
Mm,
true. But what
right.
they're really saying is, I am not the person who naps. And it's the same thing with, I don't floss. I don't identify as a flosser. I'm very few people say that because that's kind of creepy. But so if you're thinking in terms of how do you get yourself to write, you have to get into the habit of writing. And this is where Aristotle kicks in. Aristotle said that to build a habit, you need to do two things. And he actually wrote about this in his book on rhetoric. One
Yeah.
is to describe a glorious goal, one
Mm,
that you may even want to exaggerate. So, okay, why are you trying to write? What's your end goal of writing? I'm going to write the great American novel, or I'm going to tell America what it's all about and how to be its best self. That's your glorious goal. Even if you don't quite believe you're ever going to achieve it, which is where self-persuasion can kick in, you already are thinking this is really worthwhile. This is something amazing I'm going to do. But more important than that is to set the lowest incline kind of ramp.
mm,
Aristotle said, make it seem easy, cheap, and available. And what that means is if you're talking about developing a writing habit, for the same time every day. And if you're capable of doing that, that is, I find, the best thing to do. Then carve out a specific time, but don't call it your writing time. Call it me time or whatever you want to call it, however you want
Yeah.
to wait. And then don't write. Read. Put your
Mm,
smartphone away. That is the ultimate distraction, as you know, and you keep
sure.
all screens away from you as far as possible. You can add in the screen if you like to type on a laptop or whatever, but
Sure.
don't start writing right away. Spend a couple of weeks taking that time and thoroughly enjoying yourself. Then ease in. Instead of writing the great American novel, if you don't keep a diary already, keep a diary on paper with a pen so you're not going to be distracted by that screen. Or at least make sure that the Wi-Fi is broken or whatever, don't stay connected. Gradually, then assign yourself a certain number of words. However horrible those words are, don't matter. It's just the number you're going to achieve. Say you're going to write 100 words. 100 bad words doesn't matter. And every day do that. Then add on another layer. You're ratcheting up now, up this ramp that's going to get you toward your goal. The next thing you do is you take a look at what you wrote the previous day, and you can't help but find yourself rewriting it. Now you can get on your laptop because that's easier. Do it in Word or whatever you're using and build up from there. Now, I built up over years to 1,500 words a day. And
Okay.
they're bad words. I write 1,500 bad words a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet that's like, playing a horrible scales on the violin or piano. It
Hmm.
does make me better. That is the lure. I call it the lure in the ramp. Describe this glorious goal and then build up very gradually. Now, what's the downside of that? It's the most un-American thing ever. Because the American way to do it is to say, do it tomorrow, lose 30 pounds in one
Right.
day by eating ice cream or whatever. And of course, setting a longer time frame allows you to build a less inclined ramp.
Hmm. A couple of things that caught my attention. Right. The value of showing up to write those 1,500 bad words. A lot of people probably deal with this. It's the American way in some ways, right? To think that you sit down and you create the product right then, right? And that we forget that writing, like all skills, is a thing that we grow through practice. And that even if you're writing 1,500 bad words, it's like the scales, right? You're putting in the practice. You're building those muscles, you're developing those skills, even if what you're working on is not the final product, right?
Yeah, and as a number of writers have said, one of the most difficult things for a young writer to get themselves to write and be confident in that writing is that they start out being really good readers. At least I hope they do.
Yeah.
And the problem is because they're really good readers, they're such good readers that they can tell that their own writing sucks,
Uh-huh.
which is just a terrible thing for your confidence.
Yeah, yeah.
So what I have a background as an editor. I started my career
Okay.
essentially as a journalist, but also an editor, and I became a magazine editor for many years. And so I'm a really good editor. I'm really not that good a writer, but I have this confidence that I can always rewrite myself. And I think that's another way to go. A good reader can be a very good editor because that reader can say what's terrible about that writing and then think, as George Saunders would say, apply your superior taste and do that rewriting until you think that this is pretty good. And so that
Mm.
first draft will it never measure up to your writerly soul. You connect to your soul by constantly improving that writing.
And so I guess by doing it, right, by writing, this is the process by which you persuade yourself that you are in fact a writer, right? That like you don't give yourself a speech and say, I'm a writer, right? You show up every day and that consistency is what persuades you. Am I getting that right?
Well, there are other techniques you can use, and we can get
Okay.
into the manipulative stuff now if you
Sure,
want.
sure.
There are speeches you can give to yourself saying you're a writer. In fact, I'm going to look over to the side here. I
Yeah.
have taped to my wall what I call paeans, which are highly rhythmic expressions you repeat over and
Great.
over again. People call them affirmations, but a paean is really specific because it combines short and long syllables in ways
Hmm.
that the ancients thought were particularly effective. So every day before I start writing it all, I
Yeah.
say, what delights will I write today? And I even say it in that kind of rhythm.
Nice.
And as stupid as that is, I've said it often enough that I actually kind of temporarily believe it until I start writing. I'm as good a writer as anyone else. I'm focused and I write in the flow. I mean, I have these things I tell myself
Yeah.
all the time. And so those repetitions, I mean, these affirmations and the self-help books and all that actually do have a point. So repetition, a lot of research has shown this seems to be true, that you are affecting through repetition your ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which
Mm.
is the part of your brain that interprets reality. So by repeating something often enough and doing it particularly in a rhythm that makes it stick better in your head, the way music will make you follow lyrics better, say,
Yeah.
that will allow you to believe in yourself as a writer in ways that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise. Now, then the habit kicks in, and by definition, if you're writing every day, you're a writer. It doesn't.
Yeah.
You don't have to. You can be a published writer, but that's an adjective. The noun is you're a writer. Now, there's another trick you can do on yourself that's a
Yeah.
whole lot weirder and more fun,
That's the one we
which is
want.
Aristotle called this analogical thinking, and he says if
Okay.
the analog is as unlike as possible, then but yet still works, then you have the best metaphor ever. Now,
Mm.
what that means is this. I'll brag about another skill of mine.
Yeah, please.
Besides flossing and napping, I am brilliant at dishwasher loading. I don't know anybody who's better
Oh,
than me. Now, this is a problem of contention in a lot of households because there's always one who knows how to load the
right.
dishwasher, get it done right so that the dishes are clean and it's easy to unload. And then there's always someone in the family like, oh, I won't mention my wife,
Sure.
but that's who the culprit is, who I swear stands back and throws things in the dishwasher. Now, because of my superior ability to load the dishwasher, that by definition means that I'm really good at organization.
Oh,
I'm a really good organizer. Now, what is really crucial for any writer is if you're talking about a plot or an outline or a research protocol, whatever you're doing that involves writing, your ability to see patterns that your own spouse can't perceive, that makes you a better writer. And this is a great way to overcome imposter syndrome. This idea
right.
that, I may not be good right now at this one thing, but look what I can do that's analogous. And even if it seems kind of ridiculously far away, like dishwasher loading and, the literary life, actually, that makes it just that much more interesting.
Lloyd Bitzer talks about rhetoric as a means of altering reality, right? Which this sounds, I think, more controversial than it is, right? Like I often talk to students about like, it does not mean that you can give a speech that changes the charge of an electron, right? But these different kinds of reality, how we frame and point out these things, right? You could say, I'm not a good writer. Look at how good you are at putting things in a dishwasher and
I'm
find
so
those
glad.
analogous skills.
Exactly. I'm so glad you mentioned changing reality because the way the Greeks and Romans put it, you are bending souls. Now,
Yeah.
there was one of my favorite characters in ancient times was this man named Gorgias. He's
Hmm.
often pronounced Gorgias, but I prefer to call him Gorgias because he was.
Why not? There you go.
Why not? This man was the Taylor Swift of his day. I mean,
Yeah.
he was like this rap star who spoke in these rhythmic periods, as they called them, these flowing speeches that mesmerized entire crowds. The guy apparently was just brilliant, but he also taught rhetoric at the same time and charged prices that were so high. This man made so much money that he allegedly ordered a gold statue made of himself, which, you just got to love a man like that.
Yeah.
And thank God he didn't become president of ancient Greece. That would have gone south. But anyway, Gorgias believed he also was kind of a philosopher. He was a sophist,
Yeah.
and he said that there is only the appearance of reality. There is no reality other than what we think reality is. So you think about Plato's cave, the shadows on the wall don't represent the actual realness of things, as Plato said. Gorgeous said, that's nonsense. But for one thing, those shadows are all you're seeing. Therefore, that defines reality because reality is
Hmm.
only what we think reality is. And besides, even if reality were real and not just the appearance of reality, we wouldn't be able to share it with one another because all reality is personal. And you think about, our brains, they just sit there in our skull unconnected directly with anything.
Yeah.
It's our senses that are processed through our brains. And we've seen again and again how our brains will have these, what do you call it in when an AI bot hallucinates?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Your brain will hallucinate all the time. So now, when you're bending reality through your writing, Lloyd Bitzer, by the way, was a highly trained rhetorician. He
Yeah.
he knew his rhetoric. And so, as he defined, what he's really talking about is Gorgian rhetoric, which is this idea that you can literally change the reality in other people's heads, particularly through the use of tropes. Now, we talked about
Hmm.
analogy and metaphor, but some of the most powerful tropes, like metonymy and synecdoche, are so poorly known. They're that much more effective because people don't see them coming. And I actually came up with a trope. It turns out other people had come up with it, but I gave myself credit until I realized I wasn't the inventor of the trope of hyperbole. And
Okay.
and this is, by the way, this is another deeply important skill of writing, I think, which
Yeah.
is your ability to procrastinate. Um,
Yes.
Now, I have two things: a Nerf basketball, and I'm really bad at it, so that's good aerobically that I'm
Hmm.
chasing this ball that keeps hitting and missing. Um, but my other is that I have a an actual bound copy of the Oxford English Dictionary in 2 volumes with type so small it literally needs a magnifying glass. So I feel like Sherlock
Yeah.
Holmes,
Yeah.
peering into the etymology of words. And while procrastinating one time from a writing assignment, I started wondering, is hyperbole a trope? Because it kind of seems like one, but I hadn't read in any of the classics I
Hmm.
had read or the modern rhetoric that hyperbole was. I had missed people who actually had written about it. But anyway, I went to the Oxford English Dictionary and I knew that hyper is Greek for
Hmm.
above or beyond. But what does boli mean? Well, it turns out it's where we get the word ball. Boli means to throw. Now, hyperbole means to throw beyond. And the Greeks were brilliant at this, defining things. Another trope is irony, which means
Yeah.
sharp dullness. I mean, they could define things so well
Wow.
with their
Yeah.
own Greek words that we've forgotten. Anyway, so I imagine myself when I'm standing there looking at the etymology in the Oxford English Dictionary with my magnifying glass and realizing that hyperbole means to throw beyond. I instantly pictured myself as like a dog chasing after a ball the dog has thrown by himself. I
Right.
would come up with something ridiculously glorious and I would chase after it. Now, at the time, I was suffering from a debilitating hip problem that was
Mm.
making it difficult for me to walk. In fact, doctors had said, you may be in a wheelchair unless you do something about it, but we don't quite know what to do.
Yeah.
Um, I had been a passionate trail runner and Nordic skier and, loved the outdoors and had basically just been sitting gaining weight because, it was painful even to walk. Anyway, when I read this, I thought, okay, my doctor had already put me on to a specialist who had this experiment where he would inject me with hundreds of dextrose shots, sugar water essentially,
Okay.
to cause pain and sort of flood the zone of my nerves so that my glutes would stop firing and
Mm.
somehow that would make my tendons relax. So it would overcome this hip problem. Well, actually, it worked to the degree that I was then required to do at least an hour a day of PT. And
Oh.
everybody knows PT is horrible. So I needed some inspiration to do this. And my inspiration in this case was this glorious goal, a hyperbole. And I decided I wasn't going to just walk again. I was going to run again and not just run again. I was going to trail run again and not just do that. But there's this particular mountain here in New Hampshire that Olympians use to test their VO2, their oxygen
Mm.
levels, and their ability to process lactate that builds up when you
Yeah.
exercise.
Yeah.
And so is Mount Moosilauke in New Hampshire. It's this classic place. It's a perfect height and distance and incline that tests your VO2 without using a laboratory. Anyway, I decided I would try to become the first person over 50 ever to run his age up Moosilauke, which is a thing.
Wow. Yeah.
So what that means is running to the top in fewer minutes than I was old in years, so that I could
Mm.
claim And I was going to do this on my 58th birthday because on my birthday I would gain a minute because that's an extra year. And if I could do it in like, I don't know, 3 years less, I could declare myself 3 years younger, which is far more accurate than mere chronology.
There you go. Yeah.
Right. So this was my hyperbole. This was my glorious goal. Now I had to build the ramp, which I decided would take a year. And I thought this would be my experiment I would use in self-persuasion to test these tools, see which worked, which didn't, and to see whether I actually could convince myself that this obviously stupid, pointless goal was something that was kind of glorious and even noble, and that I could actually achieve it. That was the self-manipulation. I honestly thought this was deliberate on my part. I wanted to do something that was deliberately pointless and stupid.
Right.
The only problem with it is that my wife so believes in me about everything.
Oh,
I mean, this
yeah.
woman, she's a saint. That actually got in the way a little bit because no, I'm persuading myself, stop believing in me. You're not supposed to do that.
But no, it's a great illustration, I think, of how, like you say, this glorious goal and then building the ramp. And I think for a lot of people, a lot of writers, the book is the glorious goal, right? And then different writers have these different processes that build that ramp, right? I've heard stories of writers who, I heard of one who has this custom chair with a seatbelt that he clicks himself into, so he can't get up. He has to write, right? And so not only did you run the mountain, but you've written the book, not just one, right? But this is the glorious goal. And so it'd be interesting to hear, because different writers have different approaches. What can you share about your writing process? What is this ramp for you that helps you to achieve this glorious goal of actually writing things?
Well, I'll be honest with you. In
Yeah.
this case, it took me years to figure out how to write
Did it?
this book, the self-persuasion book. And the reason was I didn't want it to be like a workout book or a running book. And I really didn't want it to be your classic self-persuasion book,
Right.
lose weight, get sex. I didn't, although you can, it does work.
Sure.
But I didn't want it to be kind of cheesy. And my main goal was to inspire people to learn more about this wonderful art of rhetoric,
Yeah.
and to get people to sort of want to learn more about it. But the other thing was I didn't want it to be just about me. Do I build the narrative of the book, which is me running up the mountain, as like the spine of the entire story? Well, that kind of gets in the way. The problem is, what do I do? Do I start at the bottom of the mountain and then start talking about the tools in the beginning of my training? The two didn't go together. They didn't jibe.
Yeah.
So I did what I always do. I procrastinated. This time for
Good. Yeah.
I had other things to do, thank God. And then when I wrote a proposal, the proposal got picked up.
Mm-hmm.
Bless them. And so, and then again, I sat down to write, and I had written a 40-page proposal. I had, the outline, written 2 sample chapters, all that stuff you have to do to sell a book. Then total writer's block, which is unusual for me because I've spent my career, decades, writing on deadline. Couldn't figure out how to do this. So I went back to my skill of procrastination by looking at every travel blog I could get to on the web. And I found myself on the Cunard site because I've always wanted to take a voyage, not a cruise, a voyage across the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, from America to the UK. And of course, it was way beyond my budget. My wife doesn't like to sail. And so I'd be doing it alone, most selfish, expensive thing, completely unaffordable. So I kept going back to the site again and again, dreaming of, writing this book on the Queen Mary 2. How cool would that be?
Yeah.
Like the ultimate writer's retreat. And I stumbled across a last-minute fare, literally 4 days before the ship sailed from Brooklyn Harbor, for the worst room on the ship, for less money than a Days Inn and Applebee's, for meals. Less than that, all included, tips and everything, with marvelous food, unbelievable service on this luxurious ship, in the worst room, which turns out to be low down, so you hardly felt the ship at all, and
Okay.
plus no window, which allowed for no distractions. So I got up every morning at 4:30
Wow.
and started writing right away. This marvelous full English breakfast was delivered to me at 7 o'clock, and I'd write until 10 and then spend the rest of the day just glorying in the Queen Mary 2, reading Edith Wilson's Emily, what's her name? Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. Why not?
Okay. Yeah.
It's super fun. And that solved everything. Now, if I can get back to that 4:30 in the morning, which is really weird,
Hmm.
one of the things the Greeks had come up with was this idea that time, which they defined as chronos, this titan who controlled the clock as we know it, this progression of time we can't influence. They came up with a second version of time called kairos, which they also named a god,
Hmm.
um, which is time you can do something about. Now,
Uh,
time squeezes through the gaps in your life between what you want to do and what you're able to achieve, or moments of chaos where nothing quite fits, or what the moderns call cognitive dissonance, which is your soul, what you believe you truly are, and what you're experiencing or behaving at the same time. So, kairos is this way of worming through, finding the right time to do things, and using time to your own advantage. So, napping, for instance, is a deeply kairotic act because it means carving out a time during the day that's entirely yours and owned by no one else, even if you're being paid for that time. Your
right.
employer owns that time. You're going to use it for a nap. That's kairos. And so I decided I was going to be very kairotic about my own time by declaring my own time zone. And so I
Oh,
waited until daylight saving time turned into standard time, and the United States government granted me with an extra hour of the day. So what
hey.
I did was simply set my alarm back the night before, which made it feel like I was getting up at the same time when really I was getting up an hour earlier. And I did that 2 years in a row and declared my own time J-light savings. And
Nice.
so at 4:30 in the morning, I had already gotten used to getting up at 4:30 in the morning and writing right away. Again, that's a habit. And I do
Hmm.
it without thinking, which is really helpful because when you start thinking, that's when all the things get in the way. And of course, I'm drinking coffee while I do it. And so I can constantly see my cognitive abilities improve over 20 minutes to an hour as the caffeine begins to kick in, which is very
Yeah.
self-affirming.
I do think it's interesting to hear about your process, right? What goes on behind the scenes of the book. Behind the scenes, there's a lot, but then sometimes there are hidden treats to yourself in what you write. Is there something, or what is there that you'd like to share that's in this book that you're particularly excited about that maybe you haven't had a chance to talk about or that somebody might miss?
Oh, that's lovely. You know, it's really weird. It's funny you should say that because the part of the book I think almost no one reads um, is the further reading section,
Oh,
and
yeah.
no one's going to read it because all kinds of appendices and things
Right.
follow the actual narrative of the book. And at the very, very end is further reading. And I was so proud of what I wrote, partly
Yeah.
because I was so much in love with what I'd read.
Right.
So I have a whole section in this. Essentially, it's a chapter I wrote on further reading about the Oxford English Dictionary and
Hmm.
how revolutionary it was and how it literally transformed English language as something that was constantly evolving. And
Yeah.
in creating a whole philosophy on its own through sheer etymology, it's just so brilliant. And I got to make fun of Stoics and contrast them with Epicureans, who I like a lot better. And so further,
Yeah.
I always read further reading, of course, because that's a great way to sort of get inside the background of people. Is sort of like reading watching the extra scenes, that were deleted
Hmm.
on a DVD, or when you download an Apple
Yeah.
movie. You're getting behind the scenes and seeing what the writer himself did. The other thing that's really interesting to me is that the best preparation for writing for me is reading. Now, I'm very
Yeah.
careful not to read anything that comes close to what I'm trying to write because I
Okay. Yeah.
don't I don't want it to influence me too much, and we all unconsciously plagiarize. I didn't want any of that. So I read the ancients
Mm-hmm.
They're never going to sue me. And then I read things that seem not quite what I'm writing about. And the Oxford English Dictionary is one of them,
Yeah.
and some modern books on linguistics, which I
Okay.
don't technically write about, but learn a lot from,
Mm-hmm.
help a lot. And so if you read the further reading in books that aren't in the genre you're writing in, I personally find that hugely helpful. Not that also acknowledgments. I mean,
Yeah.
I've published long enough that I know a bunch of people in publishing. So I always look for the names of people I know. It's like
Oh,
reading
yeah.
class notes, in an alumni magazine.
Right.
But beyond that, also, it's really fun to read. Acknowledgments can teach you a lot about how the writer writes, because
Yeah.
they're describing the process as they are helped by other people. And it also, there's a moral to every acknowledgement, which is that you're not alone. Yes, you're alone in your room. I'm in a cabin
Mm.
in rural New Hampshire, in a town of 278 people. Um, my wife built this cabin, and I literally ski to it from the house in the wintertime and complain about the commute. I rely on people all the time for
Yeah.
my writing. It's writing should be solitary, but also social discipline. And reading, further reading, shows people who are long dead helping the writer out, but also those acknowledgments. I think they're two of the most important things you can read in any book.
I can affirm that there's good stuff in that further reading for anyone who picks up the book, that they should not pass it over. But then also, I think what you have to say about acknowledgments is really insightful and maybe gets to this other question. And in the book, you mentioned imposter syndrome a couple of times. And writers at all levels of experience, I think, struggle with that. So, what would you say to writers who struggle with the sense of self-doubt, right? I mean, we've talked about maybe these strategies for developing an identity of a writer, but if you still feel like you just don't have this confidence or you have this self-doubt, um, what wisdom do you have?
Aristotle would say your actions reveal your soul, or they
Great.
reveal your detachment from your soul. So your actions will tell you who you are. What won't tell you who you are influencers or
Uh,
critics. I mean, I don't read reviews of my book. I let people
mm-hmm.
tell me what they are, um, because that can be devastating. And at the same time, stay up while you're writing. If you're writing something really important or long term, unless you just have to keep up with your followers, stay off social media. And go ahead
Yeah.
and post things and respond to comments and things like that. But if there's someone who is an influencer, avoid them like the plague. I mean, I think that is the biggest, especially for women in our society. Women are constantly told how to behave more than I
Mm.
think men do, and girls more than boys. So there's always the proper behavior, and any woman who is worth her salt is misbehaving. And that can be devastating. People are constantly told, they're doing things wrong or they shouldn't be doing it. And as a result, when I worked at Dartmouth, people would, men and women, boys and girls, whatever you want to call them. I'm
Yeah.
old enough to call them boys and girls, students at Dartmouth, would come in at the end of the term with a sudden interest in journalism.
Mm.
And, I'd say, where have you been all my life? And the guys would say, well, I got an A on a paper that qualifies me to be a New York Times,
Ah.
foreign reporter. The women would say, well, I've got a Time magazine internship and I got another internship with this and that, and I speak 5 languages, and I published, my first novel at the age of 5. And I'm wondering, should I go to graduate school? And so the contrast, and here's the thing, I'm not generalizing. I don't
Yeah.
I don't remember a single exception to that. And so I think the important thing is, to be a writer, you have to write. If you are
Mm-hmm.
writing, no matter what it is, you are proving you're a writer. Imposter syndrome doesn't count. And if you're not published, that may make you a better writer. I mean, I'll tell you one more thing that should give everybody confidence. It
Yeah,
destroys
please.
mine, but it should
Oh,
help.
no.
On my batting average for book proposals, 40-word book proposals that I've sometimes spent years researching, is about 200. So in other words, 1 out of every 5 of my book proposals actually sell. And I am officially a New York Times bestselling author. And so I am used to this kind of failure. Does that make me not a writer? No, maybe it makes me a bad proposal writer, but
Okay,
I'm
yeah,
still a writer.
yeah. That's a good distinction, right? There's the creative work, and then there's the checkpoint work, and we ought not to confuse the two. This has been so wonderful. I think we could drop the pin anywhere in this interview and land on some golden writing advice. But if we could just give you the final word, what is a piece of maybe some just like bedrock writing advice, or whether it's practical or conceptual, that for a developing writer, what would you want them to know as they start out or continue on this journey of writing?
Failure is your best friend. I'll get if I do
Yeah,
2 things.
please.
And related to that is the ancient skill of suffering, which is this idea that your ability to bear pain shows the most noble kind of soul. And so failure means writing badly, recognizing that when you read it the next day, and then understanding that that pain, your ability to not only bear with it, but learn from it, will make you a better writer.
Well, Jay, thank you so much. Again, this has just been such a delight. For people who want to see more of what you're up to, where can we send them?
Well, I hesitate to say I'm on all the social media places.
No, say it.
I'm not an influencer, but my name, Jay Heinrichs, will get you wherever you want to go.
Okay.
I also have a Substack newsletter that's really pitched a lot toward writing.
Fantastic.
And again, you look up my name and you'll find that there as well.
See what I mean? Fantastic from start to finish. Well, as long as you don't get too hung up on the fact that I've never conducted an interview before.
Oh, don't worry, bud. I'm sure no one besides me will even notice.
You know, sometimes I wonder whether you're being sincere. But really, thanks to all of you for watching. This was an exciting new thing for the show, and I'd love to do more stuff like this in the future. In the meantime, I'll link to some videos about Aristotle and about writing in the end screen if you'd like to pick up not some further reading, but some further watching. But most of all, a great big thanks to Jay for spending some time with me. He already told you where you can find more of his stuff, but don't forget to check out Aristotle's Guide to Self-Persuasion. If you want more of Jay's insights and experience with less of my interruptions, be sure to pick up a copy. I can tell you that there are certainly more gems to be had in the book itself. And while you're enjoying the read, have a great week, and we'll see you again real soon.